Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 5th annual Wallace Town Hall session. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're very excited to have our 5 colleagues here with us today to talk about developing leaders for equity and excellence. I'm Michelle Young, and I'm the Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration, and we are communication partners with the Wallace Foundation, which, as you know, has for the last 15 years been focusing on the issue of quality leadership and how to develop them and how to evaluate them and how to ensure that they are working within systems that support their work. Today we're going to kind of dig down on one particular issue of that work, and that's on the development of leaders, not generally, but specifically around equity and excellence. We have with us today individuals who provide a policy perspective, a district perspective, a program perspective, a college perspective, and a research perspective. And we're hoping that by the end of the town hall session that we've been able to provide kind of a robust conversation starter for all of you today around this issue. This is a town hall, though, and so we are wanting you to be active participants in this. So Marcy Reedy, who's sitting down here in the front with a white jacket, will be coming around with a microphone after our speakers have given their introductory remarks and inviting all of you to ask questions so that we can engage the panel some more. Our first speaker today is Dr. Joseph Johnson. And Joe Johnson is the Dean of the College of Education at San Diego State University, which is the second largest college of education in California. And it serves over 4,200 students every year. Prior to becoming dean, he served as a teacher in Southeast San Diego, as a school and district administrator in New Mexico, as a State Department official in both Texas and Ohio, as a researcher at the University of Texas, and as a senior executive service director for the U.S. Department of Education. He's speaking with us today, however, in his capacity as the Executive Director of the National Center for Urban School Transformation. At this center, he identifies and studies and promotes best practices of high-performance urban schools and districts. Specifically, he identifies urban schools and that achieve outstanding academic results for every demographic group of students that they serve. And he's going to be sharing his perspective with us. Our second panelist today is Dr. Joseph Murphy. Joe is the Frank W. Mayborn Chair of Education and Associate Dean at Peabody College of Education at Vanderbilt University. He has also been a faculty member at the University of Illinois and the Ohio State University. In the public schools, Joe served as an administrator at the school, district, and state levels, and his most recent appointment was as the founding president of the Ohio Principals Leadership Academy. However, we know he's probably most well known for his work with the ISLIC standards. Joe is the founding chair of the Interstate School Leadership Licensure Consortium. He wrote the ISLIC standards and chaired the research panel that produced the revisions in 2008. He led the team that developed the ETS test called the School Leaders Licensure Assessment, which is aligned to ISLIC, and is one of the 4 co-creators of the Vanderbilt Assessment of Leadership in Education, or VAL-ED. Our third panelist is Karin Chenoweth. Karin is a writer in residence at the Education Trust, which is a national education advocacy organization that works to improve the academic achievement of all children, particularly children of color and children who live in poverty. She co-authored with Christina Theokas, Getting It Done, Leading Academic Success in Unexpected Schools. It's a very careful study of the beliefs and practices of effective leaders of high poverty and high minority schools. She regularly writes for the Huffington Post, recently published articles in Education Leadership and Kaplan, and speaks widely with the practice and policy communities. Our fourth panelist is our own Dr. Mark Gooden, the past president of UCEA. He's director of the University of Texas at Austin Principalship Program and also serves as a professor of education leadership. His research interests include the principalship, issues in urban educational leadership, and legal issues in education. Including these areas of expertise, Mark also served on the Developing Leaders to Support Diverse Learners curriculum development team, through which he and his colleagues created open access materials focused on racial awareness for leadership preparation programs. Our final panelist is Dr. Francisco Escobedo, who has been in education the better part of 26 years. Dr. Escobedo currently serves as the superintendent in the Chula Vista Elementary School District. He is the former assistant superintendent for education leadership in the South Bay Union School District, and his experiences include serving as principal research analyst for the American Institute for Research, as well as the California Regional Vice President of Achievement and Operations for the Edison Schools. We are very pleased to have all of you here with us this morning. And just one more reminder about the Q&A session. We're going to hold all questions until the end, and we welcome them quite warmly. So without further ado, we're going to get started with Dr. Johnson.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, certainly with this amazing panel. Our National Center for Urban School Transformation has, for the past 11 years, been identifying and studying very high-performing schools. These are schools that, in many ways, are different in the results that they are generating for diverse populations of students. So often in our schools, we can predict with too much accuracy how well students will perform simply by knowing these 5 variables: race, ethnicity, language background, family income, gender, and zip code. In contrast, our center looks for, identifies, celebrates, and then studies schools that are achieving outstanding results for every demographic group they serve. And as we look at these schools, we recognize that they are achieving excellence and equity. In fact, we have come to understand that, in truth, the only route to excellence, real excellence, is through equity, because equity without excellence is just mediocrity, and excellence without equity is an oxymoron. So we have endeavored to understand what is it about these schools, how is it that they achieve equity and excellence. And we've come to understand that first, what we see in these schools are these 4 pillars of excellence. We see positive, powerful relationships. And quite frankly, this does not get nearly enough attention. People talk a lot about curricular rigor. They talk about engaging effective instruction, but people do not adequately grasp the fact that at these very high-performing schools, what you see often before you see anything else is a climate and a culture in which students want to be at school. They want to be there. They want to learn. And and that adults want to come to work. They want to be a part of this outstanding team that's making a powerful difference in the lives of students. But yes, there is that rigorous challenge in curricula. There's effective, engaging instruction. There's a culture of continuous improvement. And without those elements, you don't get to equity and excellence. These are systems. When we look at these schools, we recognize that they would not have achieved what they have achieved in the absence of systems. As Paul Batalden says, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So I'll say it one more time. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. That's a scary statement. But when we look at these very successful schools, we realize how leaders have built systems that are promoting equity and excellence. And so these systems include a clear common focus on what all students should learn and master. There's commonly agreed upon and consistently utilized methods for gauging student mastery. There is this consistent provision of effective, what we call first instruction. So in other words, you don't have to wait to fail in order to get access to instruction that meets your needs. There's consistent first instruction that results from high-quality collaborative planning, supportive observations and feedback, powerful, focused professional development. There's effective, timely intervention because even with great first instruction, there will still be some children who need more. There's quality, inspiring enrichment that's accessible to all students, and that there are comprehensive efforts to promote high levels of engagement among students, parents, teachers, support personnel, and administrators. So these elements of the coherent system are working in a way that creates these pillars that we see in these effective schools. But the behavior of leaders is key. We see leaders compelling others to have hope and belief that excellence is attainable for all. And it's not just that leaders believe. That's good, but totally insufficient. Leaders have to compel others to believe. As well, leaders have to create clarity and focus so everyone knows what they need to do in order to make that belief a reality. As well, and this is a really important aspect, leaders have to identify and minimize the barriers that might impede progress on those critical tasks. So it's one thing to say, Joe, this is what you need to do in order to help us move towards equity and excellence. But if I, as a leader, don't know that these are the barriers that this teacher or this person is going to encounter along the way, then we can't help people address those barriers. Leaders are constantly building people's capacity, constantly measuring and monitoring progress, constantly recognizing and celebrating progress, constantly developing and modeling an ethic of care, and persisting. Because even though we have studied over 100 of these schools, we've never had a situation where the principal has sat down with us and said, this was a piece of cake. Nobody. So it's hard work. And leaders must persist, sometimes against formidable odds, in order to make these kinds of changes happen. So leadership forms the foundation that helps establish these pillars with these systems that influence equitable and excellent education. Dr. Murphy.
Hello. Hello, hello. I recognize a lot of you, so you have to respond. It's me. Okay. I think one of the beautiful things that you see over the last 30 years, and I was thinking about Dr. Johnson's speech, he either broke in and stole the new standards, or we broke in and stole all his ideas, one or the other, because they're this notion that the stream is flowing in the same direction. A lot of streams, but the beautiful thing is they're all going to this same river, and they're telling us the same thing. So that's quite exciting. Thank you for that. This is my picture of the world, which has been that way for about 35 years. I think schools are about justice and community and improvement. And I think of that as kind of the seed bed. If we have the seed bed, then we have possibilities. If we don't have the seed bed, then pretty much what we do doesn't have a good shot of being successful. Then there's two issues afoot here to, fertilize the seed bed, if you would. One of which has been ratcheted up hugely over the last 30 years, and that's certainly empirical evidence, qualitative, quantitative, all sorts of new methods, and I think has really gotten its fair share of attention, and we've got quite a traction on that. The other is the issue of values and morals and virtues, which, I mean, if you went to this conference, you would think it's center of gravity in school administration, but it's not. And I think one of the arguments here is you have to have almost equal attention to both of these dimensions as you try to grow justice and community and improvement. So that's kind of the starting argument, if you will. And then you'll see this is very close where Dr. Johnson was. So that's the seedbed. Then there really, if you look historically over the last, really since the early effective schools movement, which again is very isomorphic with the work that Dr. Johnson and his team is doing, you will see and Joe had the 4 pillars, which is almost the same as that we think about it. So again, the isomorphic understanding of where we are is good. We think of 2 pillars. One is academic press, and all great schools have always, are today, and always will have 2 huge foundational pillars. One is academic press. That's how we define it. It's not my job to walk you through all of these kind of issues, but I would tell you this: if you walk into the average classroom in America today and you look for these constructs, you will not see them, right? Just take the focus of work in a classroom is supposed to be constructed and authentic, right? And you go into the average classroom, the teacher is talking to students. This is national data, 80 to 85% of the time. Well, it's very hard to have constructed learning and meaningful activity if the teacher's talking 75% of the time. The second pillar is what we call supportive culture. We all talk about it, we really talk about it as pastoral care. And what's interesting is we knew a lot about the first beam, if you will, the academic press, and we've been knowing it, as my first graders would say, for a long time. And we're getting better, richer and deeper. But we didn't really know a whole lot about the second pillar, or not as much as we should have. And over the last 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, 5 years, and it's just pervasive in this convention, this sense of children need to have what we call pastoral care. They need to be cared for. They need to be supported. They actually have membership in the organization. They need to be in a safe and environment. So that's kind of the picture as we think about it. And then when you put it all together, what you get is this overall picture. So you have this very powerful kind of seedbed. From the seedbed, you grow academic press and supportive culture, and you get what you want. You get good schools, the bottom line. That's how you get good schools. It doesn't make, the work is not easy, but that's how you get them. And then I'll just close with this. This is our picture of, and Dr. Johnson's exactly right. To talk about excellence without equity is pretty stupid. And to talk about equity excellence without equity, and the term that Joe used was mediocrity, I think is exactly the right question. So when you array these things, what we do is we array the academic press and the supportive culture. And then I had a bunch of stories to tell you. Maybe I'll tell you later. But you can see they're both in play on curriculum and instruction. They're both in play on care and support and membership. And I wish I could tell you the Mark Gooden story, but it's so good, I think I'll save that. Now, the Mark Gooden story is very powerful. I heard Mark speak about 3 years ago, and it wasn't even in the context of the standards came up. And Mark made a comment that seared on me, and that was he did not see himself in the standards. And I remembered that from that day, and when I agreed to do the standards again for Wallace, that was seared in where I was. And then I'll just give you one more example, and that's the assessment. So if you want to, let's just say, for example, if you want to get good work, you would say, well, we want to have good teaching, right? And you say, okay, well, let's say we have 3 third grades where they're all good teachers. So how can you move on equity, right? You've got quality. So one of the things you could do, which we've seen people do, is take the 3 classrooms that had 22 students in 3rd grade and create 2 classrooms of 26 and 1 classroom of 14. That's an equity move in addition to the quality move, just an example. So let me stop there, leave it there. We want to make sure all the questions get put together, and let me turn it over to my comrades here.
I kind of feel like I could go home now because they already said so much of what I think is important, but I won't. So everything that they said was really is hugely important. The academic press, the caring, the beliefs, everything. But I thought I would just hone right in on the beliefs, not because you can stop at beliefs, but because this work that we're asking of principals is really difficult. And without believing that it's possible, it isn't possible. So just to give a little context, the Education Trust and I have spent more than a decade trying to identify, honor, and learn from high-performing schools with large populations of students of color and students living in poverty. And I wrote these 3 books. If there are any left, the Getting It Done is Frida, the first people who get to the table. We all have our little, graphic ways of describing this. What I say is that these schools that I have identified have invented the wheel of what it takes to ensure that all children learn. But keeping the wheel from falling apart is what I call the gravitational force of leadership. Nice, right? Yeah. We're always looking for metaphors, right? And at the end of how it's being done, it's a throwaway line. Leadership seems to be important, and then I spent a lot of time learning about leadership, and of course, the Wallace Foundation has spent a lot of time and energy kind of documenting the importance of school leadership. This is the conclusion from their big study that they funded out of the University of Washington. We have not found a single case of a school improving its student achievement record in the absence of talented leadership. I I kind of admit the possibility, but it's not what I would call an observed phenomenon. I think it's theoretically possible. The second big conclusion from that study was that the effect of leaders is second only to teachers, teachers being the largest in-school effect on student achievement. But I actually think that underestimates it. I think it's not that I think their study was wrong in any way, but leadership attracts and retains teachers. So I think that for that reason, I think leadership may even have a greater effect than has been documented. So they're important, right? What is it that's so important about them? There's a lot of information from the Wallace Foundation, and some of it's on your tables and in the back of the room, so I won't go through them. But the Wallace Foundation is a great source of information about this stuff. But so what's funny is I think Dr. Murphy said this, we're all coming at this from different perspectives, and we're all kind of converging in the same place. I start from a reportorial standpoint. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. But I did work with a researcher on getting it done, my colleague at EdTrust, Christina Theokis, who's a methodological researcher. And so we did a very careful study of the principles of these high-performing and rapidly improving schools. And one of the major things we found was that they all share common beliefs. And I'm going to talk about three today. The first being that they believe almost all students can learn to high levels if provided the right instruction. So this is Molly Bensinger-Lacey, and she actually bristles at the word almost. She hates that word. She's going for all. But most principals have some person in their head, some child in their head of the, I mean, there's a student who was attending my school long after I went, who came in a coma every day. So, you know, I mean, so I'm okay with almost all. This is Jeffrey Litt, who led turnaround in several schools in the Bronx and now is the superintendent of a charter school network that you hardly ever hear of, but it's one of the top performing networks in the state. And, you know, yeah, kids can learn, everybody says that, but we believe that children can excel. And this is that difference between mediocrity and excellence. So this is Ricardo Esparza. Whoops. Go back. Whoops. There. This is Ricardo Esparza, who led enormous success in his high-poverty school, high school up in the Yakima Valley. And most of the kids were the students of migrant workers, basically. So go ahead.
I come from poverty. I come from where the students come from. So to me, if I can make it, my belief is that I can make it, anybody can make it. So therefore, I've held strong to that point, and there was people along the way who didn't want to believe that maybe I was just an anomaly. I'm like, I am not. Our students can be just as successful as anyone else.
So the second belief is that educators have the power to help all students achieve at high levels. This is Sharon Brittingham, who led her school from being horrendous to being one of the top in the state in Delaware. And teachers have to believe that they can help all students. And this is Diane Skrika. She led enormous improvement at her high school in Elmont, New York, and it's still a very high-performing high school. And this is how she talks about it.
Sometimes what happens is because when teachers don't feel that they can do it, and they don't have the support, they start blaming kids, and they say that, oh, these kids I can't work with, they don't want to do it, their parents don't help, what do you expect me to do? That's a teacher who doesn't have the pedagogical set of skills to make a difference in their classroom. And that's indicative of a school that has become dysfunctional. When you start pointing to what the kids didn't do rather than what you can do to make it better.
So, whoops, that's telling me my time is off. My time is done. Okay, I know. So, they also believe that this work is really urgent and it's up to schools to do it. And this is Frank Lozier, whose school was named as a California Distinguished School while he was principal. Von Shepard, I'm out of time, so I will not tell you the story of Von Shepard, but he led dramatic improvement, and he told his staff, we're their parents until they walk out. He wouldn't take the excuses. So that's my wheel, that's my metaphor, and there, I'll hand it over.
Good morning. So I'm going to reiterate some of the things that you've heard here today. I want to talk to you about a study on a paper that I've worked with my research team on that we're planning to submit for publication in the next couple of months. This study comes from a set of assistant principals who were recent graduates of our principalship program. So it really gets into the conversation around, you've heard a couple of big pieces, then you're going to hear some of them repeated today. But if some of these aspects are important, how do we, one, teach it in our prep programs, and then how do we monitor what it looks like once our students go in and try to do this, not as principals, but on their way to becoming principals. So we're looking at some assistant principals here who are really trying to navigate that political landscape to do this work, but also stay in that space where they could learn themselves, but also serve as being a teacher, if you will, in somewhat, or those folks who want to proselytize folks who had not gone through the programs and who were not familiar with those concepts around equity and excellence. So that just kind of puts it in focus, I hope. So leadership orientations that emerged from the study. Our students had a sense of preparedness around the work of social justice. They found or told us time and time again that the program influenced their values and beliefs, and you heard Karin talk about that. And then they also said the program provided them with the development of some leadership strategies. And if I can put my ego aside as a program director, I have to say that's the one we need to do a little more work on, and so that'll come out. So were they prepared? The students said, yeah, we were prepared. How were we prepared? We felt like the individual professors and their assignments were there, the prevailing themes around social justice that were integrated in coursework and curriculum. All of that was great. There was an orientation towards social justice. And then we also had a familiarity with a new kind of vocabulary, because sometimes we take for granted there's some language you have to give students to discuss social justice. And we didn't realize we were doing this as much, but by integrating it into the program, they were developing a language. So Nate said, building a social justice vocabulary particularly prepared him to have difficult conversations about social justice issues he knew to be at the root of some of the difficulties on campus. Values and beliefs, did we challenge you on those? The students said yes. Once again, they reported that there was a significant impact on their values and beliefs. There was an increase in awareness and sense of responsibility for advocating for students in marginalized populations. Because as you heard earlier, the status quo is there. So it's not as easy to go in and start to advocate for those students that most folks in the schools, without saying it directly, think can't do this work. They unanimously agree that where they stand now is further advanced than when they came into the program. And an illustrative comment from Jeremy reflects this change. I came in with the mindset that if you just give everybody a chance, and if everybody, can do the work, that's totally, they'll all be able to get to where they need to get to. And he said, that's totally not true. Some kids need more help than others, and that there's an achievement gap and there's an opportunity gap for kids. So values and beliefs. And I won't read all of this to you, but I'll just say this is what Audrey said. She reported that the program had helped her realize her own biases. So what Audrey was dealing with, she was really not challenging what people were saying about other people who were Latinos. Even though she felt some way about it, she just didn't have the language, and and it challenged her, but she didn't challenge them. Samantha captures the program's influence and values, and when she says that we, the students in the program, we're talking about the models, and in a lot of prep programs, they realize that they don't have a course on class, race, and gender, and then they also do not integrate it within the program. Okay? So we found there were 4 broad themes. The participants tended to encounter a variety of values and beliefs among the adults they work with. Thank you. Stated shortly, the people had not gone through our principal prep program, and they didn't have a framework for social justice, but they did have this invisible framework for maintaining the status quo, even without knowing it. They found that they were prepared to take action that was guided by reflection, and then when they encountered resistance and pushback to their anti-racist and social justice work, what they did encounter that. And then they also found that they were much more contemplating about the responses to the people they were working with. So suffice it to say, the big piece here you've heard is, and I'll go through the quotes, but I'll pull it out. The students were really focused on maintaining the relationships. How do you have difficult conversations about race and culture and maintain the relationships? So if you look at what Larry says here, if you zoom in on, he was working with a person who had this really political stance and negative response to the students, but he said, I need this relationship in order to make this student successful. So he needed to maintain it. It's almost like Survivor when you're thinking about all of the relationships and the puzzle pieces, okay? They found that there was a range of values and beliefs. People were all over the place. But again, being the assistant principal means you're following someone else's vision. You don't want to step on their toes as principal, but as a leader, you're trying to, again, gently challenge that person to do something different that's right for kids. But again, maintain the relationship. Action guided by reflection. Glenda says, I support teachers a lot, moving from just giving the teacher all the answers to really helping them think for themselves and reflect on what they're doing and be more reflective educators. Once again, this is a non-confrontational approach. We talk to our students about really presenting or presenting people with that well-placed question that doesn't confront them but challenges their thinking. Resistance and pushback, once again, they were a little surprised by this. Thank you. But what they found is, as they interacted with folks, they needed to work through how do I really deal with resistance for the first time. And the cohort was really instrumental in the relationships they had built with their other colleagues in dealing with this. So what they found, just a quick point, this sentiment seemed to have support among teachers and other staff members. Other teachers' responses to social justice work was, and this is an academic question, why does it always have to be about race? There's always this support for the status quo where teachers express that's the way it's always been regarding racial achievement gaps. And then there was another quote here where a student is really trying to challenge the teacher to think differently about who should be included in AP courses. And, the response is, well, those are not the AP kids. So the students were saying, once again, our students who were graduates of the program said, you got to be strategic in your responses and planning, so you have to keep that in mind. So here Larry illustrated long-term thinking and acknowledging that a sustained, constructive relationship is one that's more needed than just being, right. So takeaways, I'll finish up. Social justice is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need to do more work in preparing them how to develop those relationships. We've started to look at some of the restorative justice work because we think it has a better framework for dealing with how do I develop these difficult relationships and then keep people into the conversation. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Nice being surrounded by amazing individuals here. So I'm going to try to give you a perspective from the district level. I'm the superintendent of Chula Vista Elementary School District, and give you some context. We're south from San Diego, about 5 minutes from the border of Mexico. We have about 68% of our students are Hispanic. Over 50% live in poverty, and we have also a significant number of English learners. Yet our district is very high performing. In fact, Dr. Johnson is the head of NCUS. We've been probably the leader, I believe, district leader of NCUS award winners compared to many of the districts throughout the nation. And I want to kind of share that there is, yes, school leadership is important, but there's an area that we need to kind of discover a little bit further or do more research is what is the role of district leadership? And what I want to show you here, you can compare Chula Vista with the county and state. These are the latest Smarter Balance assessment. We've done remarkably better than the county and state. But when you look at our socioeconomic disadvantaged students, you probably can't see the number too well, but you can see Chula Vista is in the blue. We also outrank the county and the state significantly by double digits. Yet, when you look at our district, and when you disaggregate the data by school, look at the range. Even though we average a 43%, our highest cluster schools were at a 65%, while our lowest was 24%. So think about that. I mean, we have pretty amazing leaders, and I heard Karin talk about that great schools or great leaders retain and attract teachers. We as a district, we retain and attract great leaders as well. I mean, we've had leaders from all over the county wanting to come into our school, into our district. Yet, why do we have such a significant disparity? And yes, I agree that culture matters tremendously. And I do agree that perhaps part of that disconnect from our lowest to our highest school, it is culture. But some of these schools have great leaders, and I do believe that part of the problem is what do we do at a district level? How do we support these leaders to look at those barriers, to help them and give them the skills to overcome those political influences that some of it is connected to those social inequities that you just heard. Also, when you look at our English learners, as a district, unfortunately, in California, we were the highest, but regrettably, it's about 26% of our English learners were meeting or exceeding standards, compared to the county only 10, and the state only 10%. Only 10% of the state of the English learners met or exceeded standards in ELA. When you look at our district, however, the range was from 49% being the highest cluster schools to 10%, which close to the state average. Why that disparity again? What do we do as a district to support these leaders to change culture? And that is something that we definitely need to kind of reflect and improve on their leadership skills. So when you compare all students, socioeconomic disadvantage, and English learners, you can see that achievement gap. And an achievement gap on, when I visit these schools, because part of the support, our district office, each executive director has a portfolio of schools. I go visit each school, and when we look at how well certain leaders move up in leadership competency, we don't see or detect a significant, change in how well one leader is better than another. But what we do see a change is the culture. The culture is different from one school to the next. And how do we build leaders to change culture? It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It's easy to improve their skills, their technical skills, how to maintain a budget, but how do you move and change culture? It's not just competencies, but it takes courage. It takes that emotional intelligence that it's very difficult to teach, very difficult to measure in an evaluation. And I believe as a district office leadership, we have to model that emotional intelligence. We have to almost role play with our leaders. How does one go against the grain when you're in front of teachers? And I agree that these cultures have been created already for many, many years, but how do you go against these difficult barriers? And one thing I would like to share with you, when we look at excellent equity is beyond the academics, is what type of enriching environment, learning environment, and aesthetics do you provide in a school? This is, back in 2008, the Youth Symphony came to us and said, hey, how come only 7% of your students are part of our symphony? Well, because all we teach are the basics, right? So we decided, well, we're going to do things differently. So we changed our learning environment. In many ways, we changed our culture. And we decided, hey, we're going to teach the arts. And as a result, we put in during the worst economic times, we invested $5 million to hire music teachers at every single school. That, my friend, changed the culture tremendously. And it is no fluke that when this is done well, student engagement improve, parent engagement improve. And as a result, 2015, now 30% of our students are part of the San Diego Youth Symphony. And no longer are we the minority in our symphony, but we're part of the diversity that should be reflected in the arts and in the music. So when we think about excellence and equity, it has to be beyond the academics. We got to think about the aesthetics, the environment. What creates, I agree, social justice. And sometimes I think as practitioners, we get so focused on the academics that we forget the other important elements that creates a beautiful tapestry of what education is all about. Thank you.
That was fantastic. So now we want to hear from the audience. What questions did their remarks raise for you about developing leaders for equity and excellence? Yes.
So we heard a lot today about what research tells us about developing leaders for equity and excellence. We've heard about preparing leaders. We've heard about a district perspective. We've heard about amazing principals and the work they've done. But how do we, I guess I always go back to the question, in a society where just yesterday a Black Lives Matter protester was kicked at a Donald Trump rally, how do we develop leaders for equity in a society that doesn't prioritize equity?
Who'd like to take that? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Erin. I'll just say I'm doing some professional development with some principals, and if you all have seen the video of the in South Carolina of the young lady who was flipped out of her desk by a school resource officer and literally picked up and thrown across the room, we had our principals review that and then give their gut response to what they saw. And suffice it to say, they critiqued each other about the range of responses. Some were very much about the rules of the building. Some were like, yeah, we don't know what happened. We don't have the data. We don't. And then but another principal who I saw was visibly upset said, wait a minute. I can't imagine in any situation when that would be right. I can't imagine a kid ever having done something like that to warrant that kind of a response from a police officer. And then some people even started talking about how, well, some school districts don't even have school resource officers that are allowed to come into the educational space like that. So once again, but it gave them a different kind of frame. So if people don't have a reconstruction of their frame, most often, remember the status quo stuff is invisible. People give responses that they think are neutral. People give responses that they think they're supposed to give as leaders. We got to maintain order. We got to maintain rules for those particular kinds of people. So if you don't start to challenge that frame and push against it in our programs and in the work that we do, and then follow up and support them as they do it, because you become the lone voice when you ask those kinds of questions. If we're not doing that, then we're not preparing people to address those kinds of issues.
I just want to say that's one of the reasons I focused on belief. Once you believe that all kids can, you start setting up systems that are different. So, for example, the second video that I showed was Diane Skrika. When she came into her high school, it was a somewhat integrated school, and the white kids were sort of doing okay, and the black kids were all in remedial classes. And you know, this was this sort of shock that she had as she walked through the school. And what she did was she opened up, she did a lot of training of the teachers, because the teachers believed this was, who documented that this was the way things had always gone. This was natural, this was normal, and she did not think it was natural and normal. So she opened up the AP classes, she detracked, she did a lot of training of the teachers to get them ready for this. The white kids left. That's the bad part. The white kids left. The black kids and Latino kids and Asian kids, they all graduate at rates of like 96, 98%. So the school is now a much better school than it was. So you have to have what one principal calls moral purpose, and that comes from the beliefs.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin.
Just very quickly, I think it's really important for educators to understand the effects of trauma in the lives of children. And that whole social, emotional, educational aspect is really critical. In our district, we have a large number of domestic violence situations, and as a result, students do behave differently. But unless teachers know and understand why and how to mitigate those effects, you know, it's hard to know what to do. So that professional development for teachers is critical. And also we're very good, those partnerships between police department and education is also, I mean, we have such a great relationship with our police department that we find out when the parents of our students are arrested, and then the next day, the police officer and our social workers go back to the family and work with the family and the student to really work on that trauma that was left behind after the arrest. So really understanding the effects of trauma and how to reverse trauma is critical. Critical.
Do we have another question? Yes, Joan Shapiro? On the side over here. Oh, sorry, David.
Thank you. A number of you have been talking today about relationships matter. And I think clearly that's such an important area. But let's talk about relationships, too, of students towards students and the concept of empathy. And I'm very aware now of a Rachel's Challenge, which comes out of Columbine. And the first child to be killed was Rachel, who was known for kindness in the school. And her father now is going around the country and developing students who really care about each other. So while we're talking about leaders, and we should, we need to also talk about our students and how they need to have empathy and understanding for each other. What are your thoughts about that?
When we talk about that first pillar of positive, powerful relationships, that includes the relationships that can be drawn in multiple directions, the relationships between teachers and students, between students and students, between teachers and parents, etc. So if the goal is to create a place where everybody feels valued, appreciated, respected, where everyone feels like they belong, everyone knows that they are a valued member of this community, then so clearly you have to be concerned about students' relationships with students. It's a major part of that climate and culture. And so in these schools, leaders recognize the centrality of that, and that is just as much of a focus for improvement as is the improvement of math instruction.
I'd just like to hear the panel maybe talk a little bit about partnerships between universities and school districts, because I think especially when we talk about equity, the university can or should be a very safe place to have some of those discussions. But a lot of times I think when assistant principals and principals move into districts with different types of organizational culture, it's potentially harder to maybe speak up in those types of settings. And so I'd just be curious, particularly with equity, how partnerships with preparation programs and school districts can work together to kind of develop those skills and principals and assistant principals.
Yeah, thanks for the question, David. And I'll be brief. What I was describing earlier, I'm actually working with a set of 15 principals from my local school district, Austin ISD, and this came on the heels of me getting some professional development, going through the SEED training that Peggy McIntosh started and has done. So we set up a whole year where we meet once a month to talk about these kinds of issues around equity. And what we notice is, once again, I may have a program that espouses anti-racist leadership, but what we hear back from our students is, what are we doing for those folks who haven't gone through this program, or who may have gone through a program 10, 15 years ago, and they didn't even have anything on race, class, and gender. What are we doing about that? So this is a part of our partnership. It's work that, I'm able to do because I don't worry so much about, getting promoted and doing those kinds of things. So it's volunteer work, but it's also something that the district endorses. We met with the superintendent Monday before I came, and we were talking about some other ways that we can create better and stronger, more consistent partnerships with doing this kind of work.
And we're very fortunate. San Diego State is an amazing partnership. In fact, we have a few of their professors. They're part of our principal leadership development program. And for aspiring principals, they have just an amazing course of study for them that is project-based, and those projects are connected to our initiatives. So there has to be some type of products where there's a direct link between the university and the district in which the practitioners reside in. A challenge is those principals who are new and are there in their first and second years, that, how do you sustain that development is a challenge that we're facing as a district, because as you well know, that first 3 to 5 years of a principalship is quite tumultuous, yet the professional development needs to be sustained. So that's a period that we are grappling with.
Next question? Okay. We'll get to you next, Philip.
Which?
Nope, right there. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Following real quickly on some of the remarks on relationships, given the fact that 70+% of the teachers in our country are white, given the fact that race plays out explicitly in the everyday lives of children in school, as witnessed by the Dear Colleague letter on disproportionality last year. I'm wondering if you think, or to what extent you think, that we need to engage race and culture more explicitly, more directly, in both reports that are influential in the field of leadership preparation, in teacher evaluation kinds of instruments, because although we hear a lot about poverty and we talk around it a lot with relationship, given how it does play out in the everyday lives of children in color in schools, do you think we need to address it more explicitly and directly and consistently?
So, a lot of folks talk about the efficacy of leaders. As if that is a one-dimensional thing. I can be efficacious in one setting and feel completely out of my element in another setting, with a different set of challenges. So if leaders are going to generate equitable and excellent results, they have to feel efficacious in working in settings where they're going to deal with teachers, staff, people who might be still predominantly white, and work with those folks in ways that will ensure academic, educational excellence for every demographic group they serve. It is part of the challenge. And if we're not explicit about what's hard about that, if we don't, so one of the pieces I talked about was these leaders in these very effective schools that had achieved equity and excellence were able to identify what was hard. They identified what were those barriers, and then they figured out ways to work around, through, against those barriers in ways that generated strong results. So we have to deliberately equip leaders so that they can identify those issues, understand them, and work intelligently in ways that will generate equity and excellence for every demographic group they serve.
So I work for the Education Trust, which has been talking about this for a very long time, and it seems that No Child Left Behind, which was an attempt to hold schools accountable for the results for their students of color and students of poverty, is going by the wayside. It's all going to fall to states to hold. The federal government really is going to have very, very little role in holding schools accountable. This is now going to go to the states. And it seems to me that universities have a real role in helping schools think about holding themselves accountable for all their students, for their students of color, their students of poverty, their students with disabilities, their students who are English language learners. Schools, and I mean, it's going to fall to states to have these accountability systems, but it's really going to fall on educators to hold themselves accountable. So I think you all have a huge role in exactly that issue.
Yeah, I'll just say, you asking should race be explicitly in our curriculum and in the work that we do? And I think you had one other question. My three answers are yes, yes, and yes.
Whatever that question.
Well, yeah, all three. That's what I was saying in my head, nodding. You know, race work is hard, and I teach in a predominantly white institution, and my students are predominantly white, and it's difficult because you're really trying to help people understand and see something that's not really obvious, and in fact, it's really couched as neutral and conflictual and confrontational. And if you don't believe me, you know, try an experiment. Try to go to the party and say, let's talk about race, and see how many people walk away from you, right? It's just hard. I can't imagine that the number of friends I have has increased since I've been doing race work. You know, I think it's going in the other direction. But that doesn't mean we should not do this work. That means absolutely we have to do this work. But we have to really help walk people through it. It is very difficult to have our white students, all of our students, do this work, but they're the ones, I think, who have had the biggest challenge, because they tell us all the time, before I came into this program about anti-racist, I knew I was white, but I didn't think I didn't think race really applied to me. So I knew about race, but I thought about the race stuff as basically somebody else's business. So that's what other people of color do. And if they're really honest, it's amazing that the quotes that you see, that's only after a year of being in the program or 2, graduating. They're seeing the same thing that they saw a year earlier in themselves. And so they forget. They're like, well, why don't these people get it? And it's like, well, maybe you didn't get it when you first walked in, but be patient, right? So there are a set of tools that you can use. Michelle was mentioning the LSDL modules. We've entitled that, to be less conflictual. Building a community of trust through racial awareness. We encourage you to use those, but once again, it is difficult to build that community of trust and talk about some of these issues. So you have to be willing to forgive people. You have to be willing to really get support for yourself as you do it. And one of the things I always emphasize when you're having these, what we call courageous conversations, encourage people to say what they need to say, but one thing you cannot do, please, 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 don't freeze people in time. When they make that comment that they made 2, 3, or 4 months earlier, that is, I cannot believe you said that. You maybe think, I cannot believe people like you are still on the earth. Don't say that out loud. But don't freeze them in time, because if it's in the pursuit of learning, it's going to benefit kids. So it's just one of those things that I get irritated when I hear people say, let's discuss diversity in race-neutral terms. And I still haven't figured out how you do that. But if you do, let me know.
Thanks, Mark. Another question, yes.
There's clearly a great deal of admirable work being done by the principals that you referred to in the programs you've been talking about. However, there seems to be an enormous focus, an intensive focus on finding the great leaders or preparing the great leader who will get things done and will do things to the various other people in the school and beyond the school. That's the impression that I've gained. So there are a lot of passive players on the stage of the school, as it were, in the way that it appears to be being approached. Yet there's a lot of leadership, arguably, occurs across the school and beyond the school. A lot of things being done. It may not be called leadership, but it's being done, and it may not be good leadership, but it's being done. So my question is really, shouldn't there be more explicit focus on co-leadership, working together, allowing things to come up from other people, from students, from teachers, support staff, community, who define or help to define together what is meant by social justice, what are the social injustices that they feel that may not be the same as what the preparation for school leadership orientates the principal to.
You ready to step up?
I'm glad you got to the front of the room. Yeah. Man was sitting back there waving for about 5 minutes. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think that's very clear. I think we need to extend the discussion a little bit outside of schools. Schools explain 15% of the achievement of children, right? That means 85% is presented somewhere else. And if we only stay inside our own home, actually it would be an interesting test if universities stopped working, didn't work with schools anymore at all, and spent all their time working with the other agencies that explained stuff. It would, so I think that would be one thing that I would argue we need to be a little more externally focused on. These things are going to come to life. They're not going to come to life because schools alone changed. This is myth, okay? The second thing is, you're exactly right. We've tried to rely on martyrs and saints, right, to fix schools for a long time. And that's a very small proportion of society. I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. Principals make 1,200 decisions a day. So the question is, how do you help people who already make 1,200 actions a day use those actions in the service of community, care, respect, culture, and pushing academics at the same time?
And the way I heard Philip's question, he was also asking a bit about distributive leadership.
Yes. Yeah. So my introduction to leadership was I walked into a school that had made an enormous improvement in Arkansas, Russellville, Arkansas. And at that time, I was very hot on reading programs. I'm still hot on reading programs, but I was just really focused on reading programs. And I said to the principal, I said, so what do you do in kindergarten and first grade? What phonics program do you use? And she said, I don't know, let's go ask. And I thought, what kind of principal doesn't know what phonics program? And what I have come to understand over the last 8, 9, 10 years is that really effective principals are not making every decision in the building. What they're doing is building the capacity of other people to make a lot of decisions. There are thousands of decisions that get made every day. And what we need is to understand sort of what level of decision making. Teachers have maintenance people. They'll be, Terry Tomlinson at George Hall Elementary says, they'll be your undertakers, right? I mean, you need to really have leadership at every level, not just at one, the principal level. The point about principals is not that they make all the decisions. The point is that they build the capacity of other people to make decisions. And that includes students and teachers.
I'd like to add, Joe talked about academic press and supportive culture, and the leader definitely plays the part to be a catalyst, right, to ensure that academic press and a supportive culture is created, but there are so many people involved as well, parents and students and teachers, but also that support structure is so critical for that to occur. And sometimes principals are left alone to a certain extent that they don't have that supportive culture around them to reflect and become better leaders, or to have someone, help them make a better decision depending on the circumstance. So one of the things that we've played around is create a cohort approach of a lead principal with 5 other principals to help them make those sound decisions, to create that academic press and supportive culture, because the role itself is a very difficult role. And I hear you, it can't be done in isolation. Yet, in many, many places, the principal is left alone, and sometimes with disastrous effects.
Another question.
Good morning. Thank you all for your presentations and your commentary. I'd like to ask a question about effective preparation programs. In the best case scenario, what does the integration of social justice look like in the curriculum in terms of courses and in terms of integration into the rest of the classes that students take, so that the graduates come out with the language, the skills, and the emotional intelligence to lead successfully?
The central answer to that is universities are not set up to do that. The universities are scaffolded on social sciences, and having discussions about social justice as a social science issue is not very productive. And then somehow the magic of integration is supposed to occur through practice. The answer to your question is you have to take your students for a problem of practice, right, around an issue like that, and have them work on it instead of going to class for 3 hours every week, right? Then you have the possibility, at least, I think, of finding what integration actually means for those students. But they don't need a course in sociology, right?
So I'll give a brief 2-part answer. I hope I can do both of those. One is we can talk specifics about the program, but I think you have to move toward integration, or you have to start with integration from at the beginning of the program. So for us, we have our Foundations of Ed Men courses, and one of the required assignments, they have to read Courageous Conversations. They have to read about race. They have to develop modules from that first day. And then we also have them at the end do a leadership in action project where we're again asking them about equity and how it really figures into their action research project that they do with other leaders in their school. We do have a race, class, and gender course, but we found that that's not enough. So we bring up what it means to be an anti-racist leader in all of their classes. Well, not all, we try to get it into all, and I can't really, we think it's in all, but I know it comes up in the school law class. I know it comes up in instructional leadership. So we try to make sure it's integrated, and then at the end, they're talking more around the language and the vocabulary. The second thing is there are 7 modules that have been developed based on the work we've done at the University of Texas, at Austin Principalship Program, and some of the work they've done in programs around the country at Lehigh and Duquesne. And those models really are, LSDL stands for Leaders Supporting Diverse Learners. So I would encourage you to really check those out, try to work on integrating those into your courses, give us some feedback on how that's working, because we want to continue having this conversation. But I believe we're moving in that direction, but those modules are a great way to get started around integration. And so, of course, Miriam, you can always reach out, and I'll be happy to try to answer what questions I can.
In our Aspiring Leaders program at San Diego State, we have our brand new candidates start the program by working with their principals to identify a specific problem at their school site. Often a problem that becomes apparent as they dig into the data about their school, whether it is academic data, social data, but they identify that problem and they work with their principal to identify a goal for changing this, and that becomes theirs throughout their program. And so that becomes the centerpiece for the program. And then all of the coursework is shaped in service to helping build the capacity of those candidates to make a difference related to that specific problem of practice. So if in a school they start to grapple with a problem that, for instance, there's a recognition that Black students are being suspended or expelled at a rate 4 times the rate of other students in the school, then the goal might be to dramatically reduce that by a certain amount. And then the field work for that person is all about working with other players in the school, digging in deeper to that problem, trying to understand how they might need to, as leaders, emerging leaders, leverage everyone's involvement, looking at the research to help them with that, identifying other schools that have similar demographics that seem to don't have that problem, and figuring out how they might go about replicating some of those best practices. So it's not in isolation. It's not a separate course. That would be a waste of time. It's all about getting them to grapple with the issue in a way that helps them understand this is what being a leader means. Right?
Well, I would like for you all to join me in thanking the panel. This was a really fantastic conversation. We've had an opportunity to hear about models of leadership for equity and excellence. We've heard research and case studies about actual leaders who are doing this kind of work. We've had a chance to think about the district conditions that support that type of leadership. And we've talked about the type of preparation, content, and experiences that candidates need in order to be able to support all the learners in their schools. I'd like to thank all of you for your great questions. Clearly, 40 minutes was not enough for the Q&A period. And also the Wallace Foundation for being able to support us in bringing in all of these different speakers and having this town hall. Thank you, and have a great day.